Good evening, everyone. It's good to have you with us again today. I know we're getting tired of this staying indoors and making it where we can't be together, but the elders have said by June the 7th, looks like we can gather together in the building, and I look forward to that. Look forward to seeing you that Sunday night for these lessons of heroes of long ago. Tonight we're talking about Isaac. Now, it is very difficult for us to separate these stories out because when a father has a child, the stories overlap and everything. But we're going to talk tonight about Isaac and how he was. Well, we're looking at three basic categories. One, he was a miracle child that came to Abraham, and all these things had a distinct influence on Isaac. And then two, Isaac had weaknesses and Isaac had accomplishments. It's very good for us to be able to see that a loving God would make sure you knew that these people are just like you and me. People with issues, people with problems, people who grew up under a certain set of circumstances that make them who they are, and if they don't work hard to change who they are, then those set of influences stay with them and are passed down to their children. We're going to see that in this particular lesson. Now, remember that at this point in historical reference to God bringing about the Christ, the Savior, the Deliverer, the Messiah, then God has honed in on one particular person in which to give this blessing that it was through him that the seed will come. And he has chosen Abraham. He's chosen Abraham simply because he wanted to. Hebrews tells us simply because he wanted to. Abraham did not earn this. He was not better than the rest and just rose to the top, but rather he chose him because that's what he wanted. And so here we are looking at his son Isaac. Now you can remember that in a miracle, and we've discussed this before, but anytime we're talking about a miracle, we're talking about a normal physical process or normal physical product without a normal physical process. So when Jesus turned water to wine, the water always turns to wine, but it has a process. You have to water the plants, and then they grow up and they have produced the grapes, and the grapes have water in them, and then they are squished and worked and everything until you have wine. In this case, he went straight from water to wine. That's the miracle. It's a physical product without the physical process. And so here in this case, Rebecca, I'm jumping ahead. Sarah was barren and had been barren all along. But this child was promised to Abraham. You can imagine what it was like for Abraham. Here he is old, and he has been promised this child, and one day he says to God, God, or at least he's thinking it, and it doesn't say it. He says, I hear you, I believe you, I trust you, but boy, I'd really like to know that I'm going to have this child, because I'm getting old, and my wife is getting older, and this is how you have children. They have to come through a woman. This has happened since the seventh day of creation. This is the only way we can get people. And so I know good and well that's the way it is, and I'd really like to know. And so God says to Abraham, all right, just so you can know not only that you're going to have a son, but you're going to have these other blessings as well. Go get a heifer, and I'm gonna goes through this blood covenant. Now, this just excited Abraham to no end because he knew he was going to have this child. So this promise to Abraham and Sarah comes true after Sarah was old, and her womb was, not only was she incapable of having a child, they call it barren, but then it comes to the point where she's past that time of life where she could have had a child, and she's old, and here they are at that point. At that point, then they have children. And they're still believing this because God has done the blood covenant, meaning he has walked through the blood with Abraham, seeing it as a burning pot and a torch. He has walked through the blood, and he knows that God will keep his promise. So he's not worried about it. And so at this point, see, when he is going to have this child, it was almost impossible for Sarah to believe. Now, Abraham had been through this, and Abraham tells Sarah all about it and everything, but still, you can imagine, here she is, old and incapable of having children, and so what does she do? She laughs about it. And she laughs, and God makes mention of this. There's a definite interest in her laughing, and later she even, when Abraham names the child Isaac, she says, "Here's what that means to me." She says this in Genesis 21, in verse 6. She says, "Sarah said, 'God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me.'" So the word Isaac meant laughter. He laughs, and here's this exciting thing that's going on between Abraham and Sarah. Finally, she is blessed with the ability to have a child and to hold her head up among other women who have many, and even Hagar, his handmaiden, had a child and had lorded it over her and everything. And so here is this child coming about in a miracle. What do you mean in a miracle? Well, the product is the same. She had a child, but her body was already dead, and Abraham was already old. So, or not our body, but I mean her body process was already dead, and Abraham already old. And so here comes this child that she could not have by the normal physical process. So we have the product without the physical process, and that makes it a miracle. So then Abraham is asked to sacrifice his child. Now, the reason this is attributed to Isaac is that Isaac went. I don't know whether I would have done that, but Isaac did that, and this is attributed to him. And him knowing who God is, him understanding who Abraham is to God. In fact, when God made this covenant with Abraham, Abraham and Sarah received his name in the covenant. Abraham and Sarah, these come from the word Jehovah, the air or the breath of God, and in their names. Now, he grew up understanding that. At the point that he goes to the sacrifice, and he's standing there, and in this particular picture, we see him as a child, but more than likely he was a youth, someone who was old enough to make their own decisions and still faithful to God, showing the ability that Abraham had to direct his family. as like we talked about this morning about elders, and God has recorded this narrative in 22. Let's read it. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you loved, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now, this means he's got to kill him, burn him completely, and leave him on this altar. And the altar probably even had to be built. This was a common thing all the way back to when Adam and Eve left the garden. Animals were sacrificed for man's sins. So they fully understood what a sacrifice of burnt offering means. And Abraham knew, that he would not have a son named Isaac again. So, verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. So now you see he had everything. Obviously he didn't know whether we'd find wood there. Look at this picture. You're not going to find much wood there. So he cut wood to begin with because he was going for a specific purpose. And he had a knife, and he carried fire. It wasn't like us; we would carry a big collider or matches or something like that. But he carried a burning ember, and in a receptacle, and he would carry it over there with him in order to start the fire. Now, as the 2 of them went on together, verse 7. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. Now, how brave Isaac was. And then he goes on, and he says, when they reached the place of God that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there. These are stones, and they would set them up in a square with the traditional Jewish or Hebrew altar had horns on the corners. In other words, they would take a pointed rock or whatever and set it up on the corners so that they had horns. When you hear about people offering to other gods, it's usually a round space, and this is a square one. And he said this: Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, when you think about Isaac, he has to allow his father to do this and lay him on the wood, knowing good and well he's going to die and be burned up. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay the son. But the angel of the Lord called out for him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham! Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. You do nothing, do not do anything to him. Now I know you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught in the horns, and he went over and took it, and they sacrificed it instead. Now, this has got to be attributed to Isaac understanding the power of God, the realness of God, that Abraham has passed down to him. Not just Abraham, but Sarah as well. Because they knew who he was. They knew the miracle it took. They had been with God for quite some time. This is like 25 years since the first time God said he's going to have a child. Here they are, old, and Isaac's respectful, and Isaac doesn't run away, and Isaac allows him to bind him, and even to the point of killing him. So you can see the learning, the understanding, and the the knowledge that has been passed from Abraham into Isaac. At Isaac's weaknesses. Isaac's weaknesses also come from his parents. A lot of times we allow, let's see how I can say this. We learn things that are improper for us to do. They don't seem improper because our parents did them. They don't seem improper because it is a normal way of life. And what that's called is a lie. And we live the lie as if it's the truth. And we do that because time has passed from the when this lie became accepted, and so because the whole world accepts it, then we accept it. And in our own little world, what our parents do, we accept and will do ourselves. This is why alcoholic children either have alcoholic parents either have alcoholic children, or they have children who will never be an alcoholic because of the example that the parents gave them. Now, the reality is, if they are this kind of person, they have decided to do it. And you remember the story about Abraham, and his wife was so beautiful that he was afraid that the king would kill him for his wife, and so he said that his wife was his sister. And here she was, up in her 90s or better, and she's just tremendously beautiful, and the king wanted her. And so he said, and literally this is true because he married his sister, but the reality is she was his wife, and he should have told. But here's what goes on in our minds. We know what to do is right, but we will do things in the moment because we're afraid. And because of that, we'll do something that is close to right. That means we lie and we make it appear to be the truth. Was his sister? Yes. Was his wife? Yes. So he should have said that. But here with Isaac, he does exactly the same thing. To avoid death, Isaac lied and said Rebekah was his sister. Just exactly the same as his father did. So now look at the power that a father has to not only pass down this huge respect of God and of Abraham as a father to Isaac, but also he passed down his weaknesses. And when Isaac was married to Rebekah, she was beautiful, and he was worried that he would be killed for his wife over in chapter 26 with Abimelech, exactly the same as his father did. Weaknesses can also be passed down easily because here's what happens. We consider them as normal to do because that's what our parents did. We see it as a response. Remember, like for example, um, your your mother answers the phone, says, "Oh, Johnny's not here," and Johnny steps out, and so that becomes a normal thing to do. We have to be very careful when we look at what we're doing and make sure that what we're doing is right before God. And then too, Isaac showed favoritism to one son, and Rebekah showed favoritism to another son. This is also a weakness that Isaac had. You remember the story where both uh, Jacob and Esau were born to them, and one of them was a hunter, and the other was more of a farmer. And the hunter was liked more by the father, and the other one more by the mother. And so one day, Esau was out hunting, and he came back, and it had been days, and he hadn't found anything, had eaten anything, and he comes in, and there's Jacob, and he sees Jacob, and Jacob has some food, some soup or something on the fire, and Esau even sells his birthright to Jacob for this bowl of soup. It's just unbelievable, beans, and that he would do such. So it showed Esau's lack of appreciation for what he's going to get, but it also showed that Jacob was cunning. In fact, the word Jacob means trickster. So Rebekah and Isaac were partial to different children, and Rebekah even talked to Jacob and told him how to sneak in a blessing. And you remember he got dressed in this clothing where it made it look like he was like Esau, hairy, and all this sort of stuff. And by this time, Isaac's old, he can't see, and he's going to bless Esau and his Rebecca calls him and says, you dress up like this and go in, let him touch you, and he'll feel the hair of a sheep and think that you're Esau. I can't imagine what Esau must have looked like. And so he goes in and he blesses him. He gives him this lineage of Christ, the blessing. And finally, Esau comes back and finds out about he hates Jacob so much that he wants to kill him, and Jacob has to flee. Now, that was done because of their favoritism and the way they passed it on to their kids. Okay, now what about Isaac's accomplishment? Well, this is extremely interesting. He was a loyal husband. Now, the story of Rebecca is pretty interesting. When he got of age and ready for a wife and everything, well, they said, well, let's not get a wife here. We want to keep this Hebrew heritage going. Go back, find from our family a woman. So he sent his servant to go find a woman, and the servant was very faithful, God-fearing man. He prays. He says, whoever comes to water my camels, will give that one as assigned as the one supposed to be my master's wife. And he finds this beautiful woman who does this, and her name is Rebecca. So he tells her all about it. He gives her the information that he's here looking for a wife for his master, and he talks to her, and she agrees, and she comes back, and he presents her to Isaac, and Isaac's like, woo, just like when Adam saw Eve, and he says, whoa, man, or woman. So here Isaac is looking at Rebecca and realizes that this is the one, and he stays loyal to her. Remember, his father had a child with Hagar, and he did not follow that example. He stayed loyal to Rebecca, and he loved her, and they had children. Jacob and Esau, the delight of Isaac's life. So then we notice that he obeyed God. All the time he did things, he was concerned about what God wanted, and he was constantly understanding and loving God. Here are three things that God expects of you, me, and every other person on earth that ever has been or ever will be. That is to hear what God says, to trust him as God. In other words, the truth teller. And then number three, to obey him. Okay, so then the last thing we see is that Isaac faithfully blessed Jacob. So you remember I told you the story, and how he came and was blessed by Isaac. But not only did he bless Jacob, but when he found out about it, and he was sorrowful, and he was mad because he could not bless his son Esau. He did not take it back from Jacob, but allowed it to be, and then gave a separate blessing to Esau, who went on to be great in his own right. But from Jacob came the Jewish nation. So here Isaac was here a patriarch of the whole Jewish nation. That nation that came out of Israel, over 1 million strong. That nation that claimed they were the chosen people, chosen by God. And it is a powerful testimony to the faithfulness of Isaac. Well, it's and a great study. Thank you for being with me.